Hello everyone, my name is Brian Mercier, President of Catholic Truth.
And I'm Isaac Leilhikar, just some random Messianic Jew.
One of the biggest topics that Protestants do not like to bring up is the canon of the Bible.
So Gary,
What better way to do my prehistoric episode of my series of the canon by going for the most low-hanging fruit.
Cyril of Jerusalem, and Jerome.
I'm honest at least.
It's very impressive to listen to you because clearly you've done the homework and you know the subject, and you should.
The way we know what Scripture is and isn't because the Bible is explicit that the Jews, not the church, were entrusted with the oracles of God. We know what books those were.
From the Tanakh, the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim.
And they have to come up with all sorts of different stories and topics and gymnastics to get around the topic.
Jesus affirmed that the Pharisees specifically had possession of Moses and the prophets, and it was the Sadducees, not the Pharisees, that laid the books up in the temple. And we know the number of books. It was 22, which are the same books that are in Protestant Old Testaments today.
And it's only logical that the Christians would have gotten their canon from the Jews, and as Justin Martyr said, the religion was transferred from the Jews to the rest of the world. There are many sources. 4th Esdras says 24 books and 70 secret books. Sirach says the law, the prophets, and the rest of the books. In Qumran it says the books of the law, the prophets, David, which at some point we know is a way of saying the Psalms. And the events, the name of Chronicles today is Davar HaYamim, which means the matters of the days. So it's possibly the first and the last of that list there. So we might have one in Qumran too.
That it was the Catholic Church who decided definitively, authoritatively, the canon of the Bible. And Luther was the first one to start, disassociating himself with this.
There is no Roman Catholic view on this before 1546. So I can look at the Catholic scholar Erasmus of Rotterdam, still asking about the distinction. And he realizes that the distinction creates a different weight between the Pentateuch and the four Gospels and books like Wisdom, Sirach, and Tobit. You see, this is Erasmus in the 1520s and 1530s.
One of the arguments Protestants love to say is that the earliest Christians just knew what Scripture was.
We actually have two canon lists from the 2nd century. They're known as the Briennios list and the list of Melito of Sardis. The Briennios list clearly includes no other books.
They haven't studied history if they know this. Nobody can claim that the Christians just knew what was Scripture.
Through whom the prophetic spirit published beforehand things that were to come to pass, ere they ever happened. And their prophecies, as they were spoken and when they were uttered, the kings who happened to be reigning among the Jews at the several times, carefully preserved in their possession, when they had been arranged in books by the prophets themselves in their own Hebrew language. In these books, then, of the prophets we found Jesus our Christ foretold as coming, born of a virgin, growing up to man's estate, and healing every disease and every sickness, and raising the dead, and being hated and unrecognized, and crucified, and dying, and rising again, and ascending into heaven, and being called the Son of God. And when Ptolemy, king of Egypt, formed a library, and endeavored to collect the writings of all men, he heard also of these prophets. And when their contents were found to be unintelligible to the Egyptians, he again sent and requested that men be commissioned to translate them into the Greek language. And when this was done, the books remained with the Egyptians, where they are until now.
The bottom line is there was no canon in the early church.
You look at not only apostolic citational usage in the New Testament, but you look at the early fathers, and you ask yourself a question. What scriptural platform are they utilizing? And when it is at all identifiable, it is almost uniformly the Greek Septuagint. I mean,
And there was nothing astonishing in God having done this. He who, when during the captivity of the people under Nebuchadnezzar, the scriptures had been corrupted, and when after 70 years the Jews had returned to their own land, then inspired Esdras the priest of the tribe of Levi to recast all the words of the former prophets and to re-establish with the people the Mosaic legislation.
Some people in the early church rejected the Old Testament.
Some allege among those who presuming to expound the scripture thus, as Theodotion the Ephesian has interpreted, and Aquila of Pontus, both Jewish proselytes. The Ebionites, following these, assert that he was begotten by Joseph. 70 of their elders, who were thoroughly skilled in the scriptures, and in both the languages, lest they might perchance by taking counsel together conceal the truth of the scriptures by their interpretation, separated them from each other. But when they came together in the same place before Ptolemy, and each of them compared his own interpretations with that of every other, God was indeed glorified, and the scriptures were acknowledged as truly divine. For all of them read out the common translation, so that even the Gentiles present perceived that the scriptures had been interpreted by the inspiration of God.
There is no question about this. The Bible of the early church was the Greek Septuagint.
Some rejected part of the Old Testament.
Where you've got the Deuterocanonical books in a kind of second tier status. Sometimes the way of thinking is that the first tier canon is for dogma, and the second tier canon is for edification.
It really doesn't make any sense, because you have a number of early fathers, including the great St. Athanasius, that utilized the Deuterocanon to defend the doctrine of the Trinity, to defend the deity of Christ.
It's preposterous. I mean, if anyone reads the earliest writings for the first 300 years of the church before the biblical canon, you're going to see several biblical canons.
There was a direct correlation between how much an early church father knew of Hebrew and the Jewish people and the Old Testament, and whether they would or would not accept those books as canonical.
Well, there do exist some who only ever quote from the Hebrew Bible.
Even though the early church fathers knew about the Apocrypha, it was very rarely quoted, and it seems to have been rejected. Okay? Now, let me explain how they used it, because that is the counterpoint, the sort of the opposite argument. We do find sparse referencing of the Apocrypha in some of the early church fathers. No question about this. Like, for example, we find Tobit quoted in Polycarp. Clement quotes wisdom. Okay?
As for Clement of Rome in particular, if you look at the Muratorian fragment, which in my opinion came from the Church of Rome, it does talk about the fact that they use the Book of Wisdom. And as I said, if you take 1 Clement while you hold the Muratorian fragment in your hand, it fits. But in a list of books where it says they either count them or use them, a phrase like that, they accept it and use it, but they don't necessarily talk about it as the scriptures.
Many scholars believe it is a late 2nd century canon of New Testament books, and the earliest canon of the New Testament scriptures likely originated in Rome. Its author's unknown, but its Latin is very poor. Wisdom of Solomon is mentioned also in the Muratorian fragment, but it's found in a New Testament collection, not an Old Testament collection. You say, wow, that's odd. Are there any parallels to that? Yes. It's found in Eusebius and Epiphanius in the 4th and late 4th century and early 5th century.
And some have tried to make the argument that because these early church fathers quoted these texts, well, these must be canon. That argument doesn't actually follow. And the reason it doesn't follow is because the early church fathers quoted many sources. And some sources they quoted a lot more than the Apocrypha. For example, Plato was incredibly widely quoted, particularly his Republic and the Timaeus. The Timaeus is the other one, Plato's text that's widely quoted across all church fathers.
And now here's another thing about the church in Africa, which although it represented one of the biggest members of the church, and of the best members of the church came from there, Tertullian, Cyprian, Augustine, it's always been a mystery where it came from. I'm told the earliest we know is that Tertullian was catechized by a certain Agrippinus, all the way up to the days of Vigilius of Thapsus and Quodvult Deus, when the Vandals came to North Africa, who were Arians, and that until the Umayyad Caliphate arrived. But here's a possibility. But here's what I wondered. What about Barnabas and Mark? and we take the earliest known voice of the Church of Africa, which is Tertullian of Carthage, which is Tunisia today, that he thinks the Book of Enoch should be counted. Mark and Barnabas both went together, who were cousins, and we know that Mark was originally from Libya, and the place that we most know of the Epistle of Barnabas are Origen and Clement from Egypt, and it was found in the Sinaiticus, which is a text typical of Egypt. And it bears the earmarks. Very interesting.
Enoch is still in the Ethiopian biblical canon. They were probably started, the Christian community in Ethiopia, by Syrian missionaries that came down.
The Ethiopian Orthodox Church includes in its Old Testament the entire Hebrew canon and the Apocrypha, but also adds Jubilees, 1st Enoch, and 4 Baruch, while rejecting books like 1st and 2nd Maccabees, giving them a canon with a massive 81 books.
And we're also going to find how people's interpretation of the Old Testament, especially Genesis 6, shows some influence of Enoch in their interpretation of the text. So just as I don't allow evidence for wisdom from Melito, I'm not going to allow that as positive evidence. It's just there, and I just want to make note of it. And Athenagoras, he references Enoch as something declared by the prophets. Clement's a very interesting early church father, and usually for me, I kind of bracket him off as being somewhat eccentric.
And so did Tertullian, and initially Origen in the 3rd century, and then by the end of that period of his life, he dropped it, and then it went off the edge along the way.
And Tertullian's student, Cyprian of Carthage, he doesn't quote it, and he has the Catholic canon. And the first person that we know as having this list is just a bit before, and it's Origen of Alexandria.
And there was no agreement fully until the Catholic Church definitively settled the matter at the Council of Rome in 382. The Pope brought all the manuscripts all around the world together, and it was completed at the Council of Carthage in 397 AD, and finally and firmly ratified by the Pope in 401
Rome
AD.
and Carthage were the 2 largest communities of Christians in the Greco-Roman world at that time, and they had the celebrated scholars starting with Tertullian and Cyprian, and then of course Augustine, all from that region.
So my thought is this: when Jerome and Augustine both make their claims that this is where precedent has left us, I do think Augustine had near-term precedent. There were churches in North Africa that had already been reading and accepting the deuterocanonical books for quite some time. So that by 397, when he writes down his list of books, he can say there's precedent. But Augustine's precedent doesn't go back very far. When Jerome says that Christians are reading only books tied to the Hebrew canon, I can actually demonstrate this from 2nd century lists that only the books in the Hebrew canon are operative for the early church. Does that make sense?
Finally and firmly ratified by the Pope in 401 AD, who said anyone who does not accept these books are anathema or are excommunicated. And from then on, all the books that were there in that council that the Catholic Church made was in every single Bible for over 1,100 years.